On April 21st, 2026, it has been exactly 100 years since a girl was born in a townhouse in Mayfair, London's most exclusive neighbourhood, whose full name was Elizabeth Alexandra Mary. She was not destined to be queen. Her father was the king's second son, the spare prince, the one no one expected to reign. And yet, through a twist of history that no one predicted, that girl became the longest reigning monarch in the entire history of Great Britain. 70 years and 214 days, more than any other British sovereign, more than Victoria, more than George III, Queen Elizabeth II. But today, we are not going to talk about her reign in the way history books tell it. We are going to talk about something Buckingham Palace never wanted to be too easy to calculate: how much money she actually had. Because there is an enormous and deliberately confusing difference between what the British monarchy is worth as an institution, what the Crown is worth as a legal entity, and what Elizabeth II had as an individual person. And when you begin to break those three things apart, you find numbers that appear in no official communiqué, and that explain why the most famous family in the world can live, as it lives without anyone being able to say precisely where the money comes from. And there is a curious detail with which we are going to begin, because it says a great deal about how this institution's mind worked. Queen Elizabeth II had two birthdays, one on April 21st, her real birthday, the one that marks her date of birth in 1926, and another in June, the so-called official birthday, the date of the great public celebration, the Trooping the Colour Parade, with 1,400 soldiers, 200 horses, and 400 musicians marching in front of Buckingham Palace. Why two birthdays? The official reason is the weather. In April, in London, it is still cold and can rain, and the great parade needs good weather. The real reason is that this is the British monarchy, which has spent centuries perfecting the art of turning convenience into tradition, and tradition into something no one dares question. If you understand the two birthdays, you understand everything that follows. There is a reason we begin with the two birthdays rather than the numbers. The two birthdays are the perfect metaphor for everything that makes the British monarchy so difficult to analyse from the outside. There is always an official version and a real version, and both are true, but neither tells the complete story. The official birthday in June has the 1,400 soldiers, the 200 horses, the 400 musicians, the royal family on the Buckingham balcony, the crowds on the Mall taking photographs. It is the spectacle. The real birthday in April is a cannon salute in Hyde Park, and a photograph published on the official account. It is the person. The monarchy always presents the spectacle first and the person second, when it presents the person at all. The tradition of the two birthdays was not invented by Elizabeth II. It was invented by George II in 1748. George II had been born in November 1683 and found it impossible to hold the great outdoor military birthday parade in the British cold of November. The solution was practical and had consequences no 18th century king could have predicted. He moved his birthday celebration to a Saturday in June and combined it with the Trooping the Colour ceremony, a military ceremony in which regiments displayed their colours to soldiers so they could recognise them on the battlefield. The combination worked so well that every subsequent monarch adopted it. Charles III, who was born in November like George II, still follows it today. It is the institutional translation of the principle the monarchy applies to everything. If something works, it becomes tradition, and tradition becomes something no one questions. Let us begin at the beginning, because to understand the fortune, you first have to understand how this woman came to where she came. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was born on April 21st, 1926. At 17, Bruton Street, Mayfair, London, in the home of her maternal grandparents. Her parents were Prince Albert, Duke of York, and his wife Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, daughter of a Scottish earl. Prince Albert was the second son of King George V. The heir to the throne was his elder brother Edward, the Prince of Wales, young, charismatic, enormously popular, and in theory going to marry, have children, and have everything continue as it always had. Little Elizabeth had little chance of becoming queen. She was the daughter of the king's second son. She could only reach the throne if her uncle Edward had no children. What happened in December 1936 changed everything. Edward VIII abdicated, not from illness, nor because of any political drama. He abdicated because he wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, an American woman twice divorced, and the British government, the Church of England, and his own family told him that was incompatible with being king. Edward chose the woman. His brother Albert, who did not want the throne, and who had a severe stammer that made public speeches a torment, became King George VI, and his daughter Elizabeth, who was 10 years old, went from being the daughter of the king's second son to being the presumptive heir to the throne of Great Britain. The story of Wallis Simpson, which appears in another chapter on this channel, has a dimension that is rarely mentioned. Without Edward's abdication, Elizabeth II would never have existed as queen. Elizabeth's childhood after the abdication was that of someone prepared for a role that no one could predict when it would arrive, but that would clearly arrive. She was educated at home, primarily, with private tutors who taught her history, languages, and the British Constitution with the seriousness of those who know that one day that girl will have to use it in earnest. She studied French until she could speak it fluently. She studied the history of the British Empire in the detail that the heir to the throne needed to understand the apparatus she would be directing. The Second World War arrived when Elizabeth was 13, and here we find one of the elements of this woman's character that partly explains why she lasted 70 years on the throne without anyone seriously asking her to leave. She did the work. She did not stay in the palace waiting for the war to end. At 16, she began appearing at public events representing her father. At 18, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army, where she learned automobile mechanics and military driving. It was the first time in history that an heir to the British throne had served in the armed forces. Her biographers say it was one of the happiest periods of her life, doing something concrete, learning something real, being among people who did not treat her as an institution. On November 8, 1947, Elizabeth married Philip Mountbatten at Westminster Abbey. They had met in 1934 at the wedding of Princess Marina of Greece to Prince George, Duke of Kent. She was 8 years old. He was 13. Years later, when they met again, the attraction was obvious to everyone, except Elizabeth's father, King George VI, who had reservations about Philip's character, and about the fact that he was the grandson of the King of Greece, but with no money of his own, and a personality that many in royal circles found too direct for the institution's tastes. Elizabeth insisted. They married. The marriage lasted 73 years, until Philip's death in April 2021, and was by every available indicator one of the most solid marriages in the history of the modern European monarchy. One of the least commented aspects of Elizabeth II's character, yet one that largely explains why the system she inherited survived 70 years of political, social, and media transformations that would have brought down less skillfully managed institutions, is her understanding of the difference between formal power and real power. The British Constitution has no single text. It is an accumulation of traditions, precedents, laws, and conventions built over centuries. And in that system, the monarch has enormous formal powers on paper that in practice cannot be exercised without devastating political consequences. The monarch can dissolve Parliament, can refuse to appoint a Prime Minister, can veto a law. But no British monarch since the 17th century has actively exercised those powers against the will of a democratically elected government. Elizabeth II understood from the beginning that her power lay not in formal acts but in continuity, being the person who was there regardless of who won elections, being the constant when governments changed, being the face that appeared in moments of national crisis to say the country remained united even when everything else was in question. It was a type of power extraordinarily difficult to quantify and extraordinarily difficult to replace. She exercised it with 15 prime ministers, from Winston Churchill, with whom she met weekly in the 1950s, and with whom she developed a relationship Churchill described as one of the privileges of his old age, to Liz Truss, whom she received 2 days before her death. On February 6, 1952, Elizabeth and Philip were in Kenya, the first leg of a tour of Australia and New Zealand, when news arrived of George VI's death. He was 56 years old. He had died of lung cancer in his sleep at Sandringham. His daughter Elizabeth, 25 years old, was at that moment Queen of the United Kingdom and all its dominions. Not in theory. In practice, immediately, without a transition period. The coronation would not be until June 2, 1953, at Westminster Abbey. But the moment her father died, Elizabeth II was Queen. She was the 6th woman in history to ascend to the British throne. The coronation of June 2, 1953, was the first major televised event in the history of Great Britain. The government had wanted the ceremony not to be broadcast. It was too intimate, too sacred, too much for the eyes of a mass audience. Elizabeth insisted it should be televised. It was the first explicit gesture of something that would define her reign for 70 years. The institution needs to be seen to survive. The television audience was 27 million people in the United Kingdom alone, in a country where many families still did not own a television set and gathered at neighbours' homes or public venues to watch the ceremony. It was the moment the British monarchy entered the media age. And now, we come to the part this video promised from the beginning. The money. Because Elizabeth II's 70-year reign was also the construction and maintenance of one of the most opaque and most misunderstood fortunes in the Western world. And to understand it, you have to separate 3 completely different things that the official narrative systematically conflates in ways that make it almost impossible to calculate the real numbers. The first category is the Crown Estate. It is a portfolio of properties and assets belonging to the monarch in their institutional function, not as an individual person. It includes more than 190,000 acres of rural land, luxury commercial properties in central London, Windsor Castle and its grounds, and the rights over the country's seabed, which crucially includes the leases on offshore wind farms, whose expansion in recent years has driven its revenues to unprecedented levels. In 2024, Crown Estate profits reached a record of $1,420 million in a single year. Forbes estimated the total value of the Crown Estate in 2021 at $19.5 billion. This money is not the Queen's or the King's. It belongs to the state. The monarchy receives a percentage of the profits through what is called the sovereign grant, which in recent years has represented 25% of Crown Estate profits and has amounted to around $100 million a year to cover the institution's operating expenses. But the capital itself is neither sellable nor inheritable by the monarch. The second category is the duchies, the Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall. The Duchy of Lancaster is an estate of land and properties currently valued at more than $900 million that generates annual income for the reigning monarch. It is the source of the fund called the Privy Purse, the sovereign's personal income, which in fiscal year 2023 to 2024 generated more than $48 million. This is personal income of the king or queen, though it comes from an institutional estate that passes from monarch to monarch. The Duchy of Cornwall, with a value of $1,200 million, is the income source for the heir to the throne and now belongs to Prince William. These duchies have operated for centuries, have their own governance structures and management teams, and are the source of the most frequent confusion about what is institutional money and what is personal money. The third category is the one of greatest interest from the standpoint of what Elizabeth II actually had as a person, her personal fortune. And here the numbers are harder to calculate because they are partly hidden. The Sunday Times Rich List, the annual ranking of the wealthiest people in the UK, included her in 1989 with an estimated fortune of £5.2 billion, which included state assets that were not actually hers. By 2015, when the list had learned to better distinguish between personal and institutional wealth, they estimated her at £340 million, placing her at number 302 on the list of the country's wealthiest people. She was not in the top 300. A woman whose name appeared on every banknote in the country and whose face adorned the postage stamps of dozens of nations was not among the 300 wealthiest people in her own. What she did own as personal property included elements of extraordinary value. Balmoral Castle in Scotland, her summer residence, valued at approximately $140 million, is private property of the royal family, not the state. The Sandringham estate in Norfolk, where the family spends Christmas, valued at $65 million, is also personal property. Outside the institutional palaces like Buckingham Palace or Windsor, which belong to the Crown estate, Elizabeth II held a portfolio of private properties of considerable value. The crown jewels are another area of deliberate confusion. The jewels the world saw at coronations and major state occasions are state patrimony and are neither sellable nor inheritable. But Elizabeth II also had a personal jewellery collection, accumulated over 70 years of state gifts, family inheritances, and personal acquisitions, which estimates place at more than $500 million. It was one of the most valuable private jewellery collections in the world. The Royal Collection of Art, which technically belongs to the institution, though it is in the monarch's custody, includes works by Rembrandt, Leonardo, Rubens, and Vermeer, with a value that makes any attempt to quantify it look absurd. The royal family's stamp collection, begun by King George V, a passionate philatelist, is estimated to be worth at least $100 million. Elizabeth II inherited that collection, and it was expanded during her reign. She also maintained more than 40 thoroughbred breeding properties over her lifetime, participating actively in the world of racing with a professional seriousness that her trainers described as genuinely expert. Her horses won more than 1,800 races during her reign. The breeding properties, the active horses, and the racing income added tens of millions more. The inheritance from the Queen Mother, who died in 2002, added another chapter to Elizabeth II's personal estate. The Queen Mother had accumulated during her own life a fortune estimated at between $80 and $100 million that included art, jewels, Fabergé eggs, and an extraordinary porcelain collection. All of it went to Elizabeth II. When Philip died in 2021, he also left an estimated personal estate of $30 million that passed to his wife. The sovereign grant system is perhaps the most interesting element of the monarchy's financial structure, because it is where the logic of the arrangement between the institution and the state is most visible. In 2012, the previous system, the civil list, a fixed amount the government paid the royal family each year, was replaced by the sovereign grant, a percentage of Crown estate profits. The initial percentage was 15%. In 2017, it was raised to 25% to finance the restoration of Buckingham Palace, whose pipes and electrical systems were in a state of deterioration that managers described as a genuine risk of fire or flooding. The result of that 25% of the Crown Estate's record, 2024 profits, would be approximately $355 million. That is what the state would transfer to the monarchy in a single year to cover its operating expenses. It is not a figure Buckingham Palace publicises with enthusiasm. The debate over whether the British monarchy costs or returns value to the taxpayer is one of the most recurring in British politics, and also one of the most difficult to resolve, because it depends on what is included in the calculation. Supporters of the monarchy note that the Crown estate generates billions for the state, that the institution attracts tourism, producing additional billions, and that the cost of the sovereign grant is small compared to those revenues. Republicans note that the Crown estate would be equally profitable under any other management structure, that tourism revenues are not exclusively attributable to the existence of the monarchy, and that the tax exemptions accumulated over generations represent a cost that never appears in the official accounts. Neither side has sufficiently clean data to win the argument definitively, which is probably exactly what the institution prefers. And then there is the element that analyses of the monarchy's fortune rarely mention because it is the most uncomfortable. The tax is not paid. Until 1993, Queen Elizabeth II paid no taxes. None. She was legally immune from income tax, capital gains tax, and inheritance tax. In 1993, under growing public pressure, the Queen voluntarily agreed to pay taxes on her personal income, which she did until her death. But the most revealing arrangement is the one established regarding inheritance tax. When a monarch dies and their estate passes to the next, the 40% inheritance tax that any ordinary British citizen pays on patrimonial transfers above certain thresholds is not paid. The 1993 agreement explicitly exempts this transmission from the usual tax. Charles III inherited the entirety of his mother's personal estate without paying that 40%. How many billions of pounds were saved in that process is a figure Buckingham Palace has never published. All of this brings us to the question that never has a clean answer. How much was the institution Elizabeth II led for 70 years actually worth? Forbes, in 2021, estimated that the total sum of the monarchy's assets as an institution, including the Crown Estate, the duchies, the palaces, the art collections, and all types of institutional assets, was approximately $28 billion. It is the value of a medium-sized corporate conglomerate. It is more than the GDP of several countries in the world. It was the patrimony of an institution that is partly financed with public money, that does not pay all the taxes its citizens pay, that transmits its wealth from generation to generation without the fiscal cost that such transmission has for everyone else, and that at the same time projects an image of disinterested public service that has proved extraordinarily effective for 70 years. Elizabeth II's reign also saw the collapse of the British Empire as a formal structure and its transformation into the Commonwealth, the organisation of 56 independent nations that maintain voluntary ties with the United Kingdom. In 1952, when Elizabeth came to the throne, the empire still existed. India had obtained independence in 1947, but many other territories remained under British rule. During her reign, more than 20 countries went from being colonies to independent nations. It was the most extensive decolonization process of modern history, and she managed it with the same equanimity with which she managed everything else, without drama, without visible nostalgia, with the acceptance that the world was changing and the institution had to change with it or disappear. The role of the Commonwealth in the economy of the monarchy is another rarely analysed element. Commonwealth countries include some of the world's most dynamic markets. India, with 1.4 billion people, Nigeria, with 220 million, Canada, and Australia, with highly developed economies. The soft power the monarchical institution provides in those contexts, the access to networks of contacts, the brand image the monarchy's name projects in certain commercial and diplomatic circles, is an asset that appears in no balance sheet, but that international relations analysts consider real and significant. There is also a dimension of Elizabeth II's reign that is rarely mentioned in the context of the institution's fortune: the Royal Collection of Art. It is the largest private art collection in the world. It contains more than 1 million objects: paintings, drawings, jewels, porcelain, books, manuscripts, furniture, textiles. It includes works by Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Rembrandt, Rubens, Vermeer, and Caravaggio. Technically, it belongs to the monarch in their institutional function, not personally, which means it is not sellable, and its value appears on no balance sheet of the Queen's personal estate. But it is in the institution's custody, displayed in the royal residences, and its management requires a team of conservators and specialists funded in part by the income it generates through visitors to the palaces. It is simultaneously a public service and an institutional asset of incalculable value. Elizabeth II's reign was also the reign of crises. The institution survived when in any other historical context they might have destroyed it. The death of Princess Diana in 1997 was perhaps the most dangerous of all. The accident in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, the paparazzi pursuit, the sense that the royal family had treated Diana with an incomprehensible coldness after her death. The British public reaction was of an intensity the royal house had not seen in decades. Flowers piled up outside Buckingham Palace. People wept in the streets. And the Queen was at Balmoral saying nothing, making no public appearance, failing to react in the way millions of people needed her to react. What happened in the days that followed was one of the most interesting exercises in institutional management of recent history. Under pressure that her advisers described as unprecedented, the Queen returned to London, appeared in public, gave a televised address in which she spoke of Diana as someone exceptional, and presided over the funeral the entire world watched live on September 6, 1997. The British television audience reached 32 million people. It was one of the most watched moments in British television history. The monarchy survived. Not without scars, but it survived. The Prince Andrew scandal was harder to manage because it had no tragic narrative arc. It was simply ugly. The Queen's son accused of having had sexual relations with a minor, trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein, with a civil lawsuit settled financially without Andrew admitting any responsibility, and with the revelation that he had maintained a friendship with Epstein long after the accusations against him were public. Elizabeth II responded, as she always responded to crises involving her children. Slowly, with the reluctance of someone who knows every move has institutional consequences, and finally, with the decision to strip him of all military titles and royal patronages and effectively remove him from the official royal agenda. It was not an effective decision. It was an institutional one. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry represented a different type of challenge. It was not a scandal in the traditional sense. It was something deeper. Two people deciding that the institution's rules did not serve them, and saying so publicly in an interview with Oprah Winfrey, watched by 49 million people worldwide, with accusations about racism within the royal family and about Meghan's mental health being ignored by the institution. The Queen responded with a phrase that in its brevity summarized 70 years of institutional discipline. Recollections may vary. It was the most contained possible response to the most serious accusations the royal family had faced publicly in generations. The last years of Elizabeth II's reign were also those of a woman whose body was telling her that 70 years of public service exact a cost. Philip's death in April 2021 was, according to everyone who knew her, the hardest blow of her life. They had married when she was 21. She had reigned for 73 years with him at her side. The photograph of the Queen at Philip's funeral, sitting alone on the chapel bench at Windsor, wearing a mask because of COVID restrictions, is one of the most powerful and most sorrowful images of modern monarchy. The most powerful woman in the world, completely alone in the moment of her most intimate loss. On September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, surrounded by her family, Elizabeth II died. She was 96 years old. 2 days earlier, she had received Liz Truss, her 15th Prime Minister, at Balmoral, in the only time in her reign she had not received a new head of government at Buckingham Palace. It was the last public image of a queen who to the very end did the work. Her son Charles, who had waited 70 years to be king, became Charles III the instant his mother died. The fortune Charles inherited from his mother, free of inheritance tax under the 1993 arrangement, included Balmoral, Sandringham, the personal jewellery collection, the private art collection, the horses and breeding estates, and the Duchy of Lancaster account. Estimates of the personal estate that passed from mother to son range from $500 million to $1 billion, depending on how the less liquid assets are valued. No official source has ever given a precise figure. The opacity is part of the system. Elizabeth II's jubilees are another way of understanding the relationship between the institution and the public that funds and sustains it. The Silver Jubilee was in 1977, 25 years of reign. The Golden Jubilee in 2002, 50 years. The Diamond Jubilee in 2012, 60 years. And the Platinum Jubilee in 2022, 70 years. Each of those events was a demonstration of something that institutional communication strategists study as a success case. The ability to turn a person's anniversaries into national celebrations in which millions of citizens participate voluntarily and that generate the kind of collective identity feeling that no marketing campaign could produce artificially. The 2022 Platinum Jubilee, celebrated with the Queen already in very fragile health, was followed by millions of people in the United Kingdom and around the world. It was the demonstration that 70 years of consistent public image had created something that transcends politics and the debate about the cost of the institution. The succession process that followed Elizabeth II's death in September 2022 revealed some of the institution's financial mechanics that are rarely visible in normal times. Charles III inherited the entirety of the Duchy of Lancaster and its $48 million in annual income. The Duchy of Cornwall passed automatically to Prince William as the new heir, with its $1,200 million in value and annual income of more than $24 million. And the Queen's personal estate, the sum of Balmoral, Sandringham, the jewels, the collections, the horses, and the investments, passed to Charles, free of inheritance tax, under the agreement his mother had negotiated with John Major's government in 1993. The debate over taxes the monarchy does not pay is the one that most discomforts contemporary analyses. The 40% inheritance tax that ordinary British citizens pay on patrimonial transfers above certain thresholds is one of the highest in Europe. It is the tax that most affects the transmission of wealth between generations, and it is precisely the tax from which the monarchy is explicitly exempt in monarch-to-monarch transmissions. When Charles III inherited from Elizabeth II, the differential between what he paid and what any other citizen with that estate would have paid is estimated in the hundreds of millions of pounds. The official argument is that the monarchy's patrimony is institutional, not personal, and that applying inheritance tax to it would distort its capacity to function. The counter-argument is that if the patrimony is so institutional, it should be subject to full state scrutiny, including that of the National Audit Office, which historically has not had access to the royal household's finances. The role of the Panama Papers and Pandora Papers in the story of royal finances adds another dimension to the portrait. In 2021, the Pandora Papers, the massive leak of offshore financial documents, revealed that the Duchy of Lancaster had invested in offshore funds in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands, crown dependencies that are also well-known tax havens. The total of the revealed investments was around £10 million, a small fraction of the duchy's total value, but politically significant enough to generate weeks of news and parliamentary questions. Buckingham Palace responded that the investments complied with all applicable rules. That was technically true. It was also a perfect example of the difference between what is legal and what the institution of the monarchy wants the public to know about its financial practices. The relationship between Elizabeth II's reign and the Jubilees brings us full circle to what the institution understood about longevity. It is worth noting that the monarchy that survived into the 21st century is unusual by historical standards. The Romanovs of Russia had in 1917 the largest private fortune in the world: palaces, jewels, properties, investments abroad. The Bolshevik Revolution executed them and took everything. The Habsburgs of the Austro-Hungarian Empire lost their throne in 1918, and the Austrian state kept most of their patrimony. The Hohenzollern Germans spent decades in litigation, trying to recover part of their properties confiscated after World War II. The British monarchy survived because it learned before the others that the relationship with the public in a democracy requires an image of service and legitimacy that no amount of wealth can purchase if it is lost. What this video hopes to have made clear is the difference between the monarchy as an institution and the woman who led it for 70 years. Elizabeth II was not a billionaire in the sense that Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos are billionaires, but she was the beneficiary of an extraordinarily complex system of properties, income, tax exemptions, and hereditary transmissions that made her personal wealth a fraction of the institutional wealth she managed, while that institutional wealth was maintained and grew, in part thanks to the image of selfless service she projected. It was the central paradox of her entire life. The person whose face appeared on the money of dozens of countries was never completely transparent about how much money she had. She was the head of an institution that presents itself as the heritage of the nation while accumulating assets that no normal democratic nation would allow in private hands without subjecting them to ordinary taxation. And she was also, independent of all of that, someone who from the age of 16 to 96 did the work she had been given to do with a consistency and dedication that few of her contemporaries could have sustained. On the centenary of her birth, this April 21st, 2026, what remains of Elizabeth II is an institution that her son inherits, transformed. with less formal power than in 1952, with more public scrutiny than at any other point in its history, and with the open question of whether the 21st century has room for something like a hereditary monarchy, with these levels of wealth not subject to the ordinary rules. It is the question that Elizabeth II's 70-year reign never had to answer definitively, because she knew how to keep it always on the horizon without ever letting it land. Whether Charles III's reign will manage the same is the next question. And that one, like everything concerning the Windsors, still has no answer. The image of the 2 birthdays with which we began this video, and to which it is worth returning at the end, is perfect, because it contains the entire management philosophy that made the longest reign in British history possible. There is a real birthday, April 21st, intimate, private, without apparatus, with a cannon salute in Hyde Park as the only public concession. And there is an official birthday, in June, with the soldiers and the horses and the musicians and the family on the balcony. The first is the person, the second is the institution. And the greatness of Elizabeth II, if one can use that word without falling into hagiography, was having understood for 70 years that the institution needed the spectacle of the second to survive, and that the person needed the silence of the first to remain human within that spectacle. She maintained that distinction with a discipline that few human beings in any position could have sustained. On the centenary of her birth, this April 21st, 2026, what remains of Elizabeth Alexandra Mary is Balmoral Castle, with its 100 years of family memories. The art collection in the palaces, the testimony of 15 prime ministers about the weekly conversations, and the open question of whether the 21st century has room for something like this. There is no definitive answer to that question, but the question, at least, is more honest than the spectacle of the second birthday. And that is the kind of honesty that Elizabeth II, paradoxically, was always better at generating from outside the institution she represented than from within it. There is one last story that summarizes who, Elizabeth II, was better than any financial or political analysis. In the final months of her life, with the mobility problems that prevented her from climbing stairs and had dramatically reduced her public appearances, she continued attending to her commitments in a way her collaborators found astonishing. When Liz Truss was appointed Prime Minister on September 6, 2022, the Queen was clearly ill, clearly at the end of her strength, but she insisted on holding the appointment audience at Balmoral, rather than asking Truss to wait until the Queen was in better condition or having the meeting by video call. It was not protocol that compelled her. Protocol would have perfectly allowed an alternative format. It was the understanding that doing the work, until the end, was what distinguished her from any other person in any other position. She died 48 hours after that audience. It was the most compressed and most defining moment of her entire character, fulfilling the last formal act of her reign with the body already in the process of ceasing to function and then letting go. She was the same person who at 16 had joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, who at 25 had ascended the throne without time to prepare emotionally because the work could not wait, who for 70 years had responded to every crisis with the same equanimity that produced in those who observed her the feeling that the country was in good hands, even when clearly not everything was going well. The centenary of April 21st, 2026 is the best available moment to do exactly what this video has attempted, to see Elizabeth II whole, with her opaque fortune and her tax exemptions and her Pandora papers and her collection of colonial diamonds, and also with her 70 years of constant work and her 73-year marriage and her corgis and her genuine love of horses and her unexpected sense of humor. Both things are true at the same time, and only when you see the two together do you understand why the institution she represented survived a century that destroyed almost every other European monarchy. Happy birthday, Ma'am! If this video has reached you, if at any moment you have thought about the difference between what the monarchy shows and what the monarchy has, leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the funding system of European monarchies is reasonable? Or is it a privilege the 21st century can no longer justify? The debate is open. And if you want more about the real history of royal families, beyond the protocol and the parades, this channel has more chapters. Subscribe.